here with those two great personalities of the world of letters and sometimes of the world of state and politics, just sometimes. But we are here to talk about book, places, and characters. I thought we would talk about The Prince, which is the favorite classic of the two authors, of the two writers here, and speaking about The Prince and about Florence and about the Medici, I thought I would also ask Salman about the book Enchantress of the Florence, the novel he wrote about this same period. I'm going to ask President Fernando Henrique to start.
Let's just say Fernando.
Fernando. Luis is going to kill me if I call you Fernando. Okay. Okay. President Fernando Henrique. Machiavelli showed that the world of politics can be explained by itself. It's a world of ambition, a world of strength, a world of human weakness. Could you tell us why this model of thinking about politics and the power is until nowadays very alive? It's a model it's a way of understanding politics since nowadays.
Oh, I'm not sure if this is the better way to understand politics. The importance of Machiavel came from the fact that Machiavel, in fact, was one of the first to describe political life, such political life is. That is to say, not referring to values, not referring to end values. He was in a kind of dialogue with the classic tradition, either from Aristotle or Cicero. That's to say, Aristotle said, well, we have to look after the well-being of people. In fact, the word he used was different, it was the happiness of people. Meanwhile, Cicero would say, well, only the virtuous people are able to be effective in political life, since it's supposed to produce a kind of consensus among the good people and to rule in an effective way. And Machiavel opposed to this by saying, no, politics is different. He described how this situation was perceived at the time. And one of the virtues of Machiavelli's book is exactly that he's dealing with real facts. He's dealing, and Machiavelli has in your novel, it's also again repeated there, Machiavelli was, interacting with people. He was a practical political man. Not just political man, but was also a wise man who had enormous amount of knowledge about the classic history and how politics in fact evolved. So that is the novelty of Machiavel. I must add that Machiavel wrote his book in a very specific moment when, the idea of state was beginning to be conceived as a tool, an instrument. And it was being created as an institution. So that's the novelty of Machiavel. Then there are other aspects probably you asked me about, but that, I will stop here, otherwise I will repeat what I said yesterday.
Machiavelli and Freire, for example, putting together both. How Machiavellical was to Freire, for example?
Freire was. The point is that Freire, in the book, yes, I commented yesterday, Order and Progress, was discussing the political situation. But normally Freire was not looking after political situation, he was looking after the social processes, and maybe to some extent minimizing the role of government. So when Freire starts by describing the republic and the end of the monarchy, so at that point he starts by spelling his own ideas about government, but never in the sense of Machiavelli. He was not prescribing any form of behavior. He was just complaining the fact that the emergence of new realities in Brazil was stopping the tradition of the Brazilian life organized under the patriarchal family. So it's quite different, the approach.
Salman, I want to ask you the same question in an opposite way. How could you put together the Italy of the Medici, of the Machiavelli, and also the Emperor Akbar, relative from Genghis Khan? My question is, do you think that you had in front of you two different ways of dealing with politics, or is the opposite? They look very much alike.
Well, it's true that both of them, both the Emperor Akbar in India and Niccolo Machiavelli are very concerned with the nature of power and whether it is possible for a powerful man to be good. You know, I mean, that's the great question. And Machiavelli in The Prince answers by saying, not really. But Akbar is very invested in the idea of the good, in the idea of being the just king, you know, and so there's that tension between their thinking. But I feel that in a way Machiavelli has had an unfair treatment from history, you know, because his name has come to represent a certain kind of cynicism and amorality, a kind of ruthlessness of power politics, as if he was recommending it, you know, rather than observing it. You know, you have to remember the circumstances in which this great book, The Prince, was written. Machiavelli, remember, was a lifelong advocate of the Republic, you know, not of princes. The only time he was ever a public servant was during the period when the Medici were expelled from Florence, and he became a servant of the Republic of Florence. And in fact, when the Medicis came back to power, they didn't like him. They tried to find a way of getting rid of him, and in fact tortured him. He was very seriously tortured by the Medicis with a horrible torture called the strappado. The strappado is when both your hands are tied behind your back, and then the rope is taken over a pulley, and you're pulled off your feet from like that, you know. And usually, when people are subjected to this, they will confess to raping their grandmother, you know. I mean, at once, you know. And Machiavelli was subjected to it 4 times, and confessed nothing. So they were unable to kill him. They could only exile him. So this is not a man who loved princes. You know, this is a man with very good reason not to love princes. He was tortured and exiled by them. And so the book is not in praise of the behavior of princes, you know, but it is incredibly truthfully, in a very disenchanted way, observing the behavior of princes and the nature of power, you know, and some of the things he says are very shocking. I mean, for instance, there's a famous chapter in which he asks whether it is better for the prince to be feared or loved. And he answers it is much better to be feared, because love goes away, but fear remains. So it's more durable. He has a wonderful image where he says, if you become the prince, what you should do is do all the terrible things you have to do on the first day. Kill everybody on the first day. Because afterwards, people will say, well, he's not as bad as he used to be. And these things have become celebrated and have made people think that he is the cynic. You know, whereas actually what he is doing is observing the behavior of princes and saying this is how it goes.
President Fernando Henrique, you also said in your introduction that you talked about the same, almost the same, you had the same argument, the same interpretation, but we also mentioned that he lived in a transitional moment that could explain the circumstance of the book, that the book has a kind of paradox, because Machiavelli was a kind of, as a patriot, he wanted Italy would be unified. As a citizen coming from Florence, he would want the independence and the republic, but he worked for the prince, so he would have to give like tips for the king. Is it good or not? What's the importance of right peace or dealing in transitional moments in politics?
What you said is correct. Let's say Machiavelli was expressing a moment of transition, and as Salman said, he was a Republican, he was a nationalist too, he was in favor of the unification of Italy. So he was working under those circumstances. Is it true that he was not preaching, cynicism? But the point is that describing, for instance, Cesar Borgia's behavior, he was so enthusiastic with the way how Borgia was capable to produce the massacres, and also in the way how Borgia was putting the guilt on another person, and by dismissing this man who was in fact his commander-in-chief in order to be occupying Romagna in Italy. And on the contrary, he was complaining the fact that Cesar Borgia, who was also a cardinal, it was a wonderful time to be cardinal and militar and prince. Well, Cesar Borgia was a cardinal, and his father was the Pope, which is also strange for us, but anyhow. So, and when Machiavelli, trying to describe the moment of the replacement of the Pope, blames Cesar Borgia because Cesar Borgia was not capable to appoint and sustain a Pope more close to him. So he said, this is weakness of the prince. Meanwhile, when you are killing, making massacres, this is your virtue. So that's why the cynicism appears as if it was a characteristic of Machiavel. But he has always also a footnote, even to behave in that way, bad way, is only for the great princes in some specific moments putting at risk the unity of the republic. It's not a day-by-day prescription. In some moments you have to make a choice. In that case, you have to keep your power. What you have the main responsibility for a prince is to keep the power. Well, today this is not more possible. We have elections. Everyone tries to stay for longer, but
also, I think two things. One is in the question of the Borgia papacy. You know, that of course the Medici family was also very interested in having the papacy. So the question of disapproving of the Borgia Pope is also a way of desiring a Medici Pope, you know. So, and there were many times when the Medici also had the papacy as well as the ruling position in Florence. So, and you have to remember that the Pope at this time is not just a religious leader. He is also the leader of the most powerful state, you know, and a military leader. Often you had the Pope leading people into battle, which is a thing maybe desirable, I don't know. But the thing I wanted to say about the book, about the Prince, is that there's a very profound sense in which it's a work of irony, because in this period there was a convention of literature, hagiographic literature, which was called Mirror of Princes, you know, where a prince would hire some writer to write about how wonderful he was, you know, to say about all his battles and his good looks and his intelligence and his wit and his wisdom and so on, and these little books would be produced for princes to be worshipful of them and admiring of them. And this was a whole tradition of literature in Italy at this time.
Akbar had an employee that would be
specializing in sort of love of the prince. Yeah. And so Machiavelli uses precisely the format of the Mirror of Princes book, precisely the format of that book, in order to demolish the idea of the prince as a figure to be worshipped. You know, and so it also has to be seen that its literary context, you know, is profoundly ironic. And I think, of course, we have lost that context because such books no longer are written and no longer exist. You know? So we don't see the way in which he is writing a deliberate distortion of a particular kind of literature which does not tell the truth, to use the same format in order to tell the truth. You know?
And not by chance, Machiavelli's book was put into index because of that, because of the fact that it was criticizing and not just praising.
And was banned everywhere. You know, the strange thing about the slander of his name, it began very quickly. In the literature of England, in the Elizabethan period, it's calculated that there are 400 references to Machiavelli, and none of them is complimentary.
The problem has gone on.
Yes, it's gone on. His name has become this slander, almost, and it's very unfair.
Sometimes, President, popular memory remembers just sentences or words. This is the case of Machiavelli, and you suffer with this kind of thing. For example, Machiavelli was not a Machiavellical person.
Yes, correct.
So, and we suffered with this kind of thing. Sentences, words that popular memory would remember, and we would never.
Well, I cannot compare myself to Machiavel.
For example, the prince.
I have an advantage. I was a prince, he was not. In one disadvantage, he was a big political thinker, I'm not. We cannot be compared. But anyhow, it's true that in political life, very often, because this belongs to the political struggle, it's possible to extract some phrases, or some ideas maybe, but put in a different context and to repeat it again and again. Now, even in my case, what is very often remembered is that I'm blaming to have said at one point in time that you have to forget everything I wrote. I never said that. So now I publish a small book saying, remembering what I wrote. This is somebody saying you repeat it again and again by people who never read anything I published. But this is political life, it's not intellectual life. You see? In the case of Machiavel, it's a little bit different, because it's not political struggle, it's an intellectual misconception, an intellectual, bad understanding of the sense of Machiavelli's works.
Yes,
It was in the middle of a fight, no? A political fight.
Political fight,
I was going to say, I also have a little experience of people representing my work without reading it.
Would you tell us about this?
No, it's a lot
Just remember us. Machiavelli wrote a book called The Mandrake. It was a kind of satirical critique of the seduction. In your novel, Antonino Argalia, Niccolo Machiavelli, and Amerigo Vespuccini are in the search of the Mandrake. How, and they find it, sometimes, not always, and how and when fiction and non-fiction meet?
Well, it's working. It's not working. This one's all right. Well, one of the things that is enjoyable when you go into the past is that the real figures of the past are known, but not everything is known about them. So there's plenty of room for the imagination. And in that case, of course, I wanted to be faithful to what was known about Machiavelli. So I didn't want to falsify his character. But there's still plenty of room to make up what his childhood was like, and where he went looking for mushrooms and mandrake roots, and who were the friends of his youth, and so on. There's one thing I'm very proud of, which is actually the Vespucci who is in the book is not Amerigo Vespucci. It's a cousin of his called Agostino Vespucci, who was a real person, very minor figure. But recently, there's an extraordinary thing. I don't know if you read last year in the papers that they had finally identified the Mona Lisa, for sure. Everybody thought that it was this girl, Mona Lisa del Giocondo, but there was no documentary proof. And then in the vaults of the city of Florence last year, they found a letter, official letter of the city, and in the margin somebody had written that Leonardo has painted this picture and the girl in the picture is Mona Lisa del Giocondo. Right? The person who did this is Agostino Vespucci. So suddenly this very minor figure who very little is known about, I more or less made him up, suddenly he leaps out of history and identifies the Mona Lisa, I felt almost parental pride. Yes. No, so this is, Agostino is one of these figures who we knew that he was a clerk in the same department as Machiavelli worked in. He worked for Machiavelli, and that they were they were drinking partners and gambling. In fact, there's one story which is very amusing where Agostino Vespucci gave a dinner party for some of his friends, and they came, and at the end of the dinner party he gave them a bill. They had to pay for their share of the dinner. And Machiavelli was very, very offended by this, and for a long time refused to pay. But in the end he did pay. So you have these holes, you know, in the past which allow you to insert fiction. And I guess the secret is, as I say, to be true to what you know. But then at least you have space, you know, in a novel. With Machiavelli, I think it was important to me to try and portray him as the person that the little that survives about him as a person shows that he was a very gregarious, extrovert personality. That, you know, there's a letter actually that Agostino Vespucci wrote to him when he was out of Florence on government business, which says something like, please come back quickly for two reasons. One is people are intriguing against you while you're away, and the other is that while you're out of town, there is nobody to organize the fun. And he was clearly, amongst his social circle, the one who was the source of the fun, you know? And that's not, you don't have that idea of him. But as I say, in the little fragments that come down to us, it suggests that. So then I wanted to create him in that way.
In that sense, I could make some connections with Gilberto Freire's, because Machiavelli is an example of a kind of a non-organized family life, sexual life, etc. He was really, as you said, as a character, it was fantastic. Always ask for fun. He was on trial because of what they, at the time, they considered not correct sexual practices. He was blamed, etc. So it's, the Machiavelli as a person is quite different from the idea that we formed about Machiavelli as a political thinker. And I read your novel, not very cautiously because I received it recently, but I was fascinated by the way how you has been capable to got very important bumps and moments and to some extent to transform Machiavelli into a man, a concrete man. This is important.
Well, you know, what was for me the most pleasurable thing about that book is I had to present it in Florence, you know, to the people of Florence, and I was kind of scared because sometimes people don't like it. You know, if somebody comes from another country and tells them about their own town, they don't necessarily like it. You know? And in Italy particularly, actually. But, so I was a little concerned. But instead, they did the opposite, which is that they were very generous about the book. And the thing that they said, which I liked, was they said that when they are taught the history of this period, they are taught it as the greatest moment in the history of Italy. You know, so they're taught it in a very idealized way. There are these geniuses of government and philosophy and art and so on, and this great pinnacle of Italian culture. You know, and they're taught everything as if it was wonderful. And then they said, we read your book, and there are people getting drunk and gambling and going to whorehouses, and these are the same people that they are told are these very idealized figures. And so because they were able to see these people in a more human context, it was unusual for them, you know, and so they liked it. My goodness.
Let me ask you the same question. When in politics and when in the states, fiction and non-fiction can meet, do you have often this kind of situation?
Well, in the case of Brazil, very often. Normally,
you can't talk about Italy. About
you know, normally we have in Brazil this soap art in Brazil, very famous, and very often are more realistic than the news. And that's a normal experience for those who have practiced in dealing with power. I wrote several times. I make some alerts for the future historians. Please don't take very seriously what has been said about what I did, and at least don't take seriously about the intentions I had, because very often people refer to your intentions in making comments. Well, Who knows about intention? Sometimes even the political man himself has no idea exactly what he wants. You see, you have to ask the psychoanalyst or a priest, I don't know who, to understand what are the motivations. And very often people judge motivations and add motivation to and connecting with practical behaviors. So the relation between imagination, novel, and reality is is normal. But I would say this is life. Life is like that. Very often we imagine something, you do another thing. That is, I don't believe that it's possible to completely separate the world of imagination and reality. Reality is composed also by imagination. And what is more important in every realm of culture, of life, is imagination. Even not just for novelists, that's why they are the master, the number one, because they confess themselves as men of imagination. But what is a painter? He's a man of imagination. What is a scientist? If he decides that he's not a man of imagination, it's routine, and routine is senseless for the production of novelty. The same applies to political people. Without imagination, without this linkage between reality and what we want to create and transform with some imagination, it's impossible to behave properly. So,
because yesterday you talked about science and Florestan Fernandes, how you thought you were so scientific, and others would use the imagination more than...
Yes, but even a scientificist, an objectivist, without imagination cannot do anything.
No, you have to imagine the wheel before you have a wheel.
Yeah, of course. And what is new? When you relate to something that no one has related with another one, another thing. And this requires imagination. Science is exactly the same. There is no that gap between novelists and scientists or political people, I guess.
Well, the old word, of course, the origin of the word science is just knowledge, and there is not a distinction between scientific and artistic knowledge. And I agree absolutely, and I think it's one of our great characteristics is that we are people who can imagine the thing that is not, and then sometimes we can bring it into being, and sometimes we can fail to do so, but we can try, and that is true whether we are artists or not artists.
In the case of scientists, it's possible to imagine something that is not, but you have to prove. That's the difference. You have to compare and to prove if your imagination has some connection with.
But that's also true. You have to imagine.
I agree with you too.
You have to imagine that somebody might fall in love with you before they do.
Oh, I do that day and night.
Oh, they don't. But you still have. At some point, you have to prove it.
Akbar was a very, you described it, the Akbar, the emperor, like a philosophical king, a very generous king with a lot of tolerance. And if you think about Savonarola, at the same time, he was a Republican dictator. Do you both think that civilizations and barbarous civilization and barbarous habits, sometimes they trade places?
Oh, yes, you can have a barbaric democrat. Several presidents of the United States come to mind.
But I have some doubts about their democracies.
Yeah, that's true. But at least in one case they might have been elected. Although maybe they weren't really. That's another question. But no, I mean, of course they can. And the thing that interested me about Akbar, I mean, many people have written about Akbar's tolerance and open-mindedness, But I think it's too simple to say that he is simply this kind of proto-democrat, because he's also a tyrant. He is an absolute ruler. And he is not interested in not being an absolute ruler. He wants to be, he has the power of life and death over everyone. And that's who he wants to be. But within that context, he is also thinking about goodness and justice. And that makes him very unusual. Particularly if you look at his family line, You know, I mean, this is somebody in the direct line of descent from Genghis Khan. You know, and if you look at his ancestors, they are people of blood. You know, it was always known about the Mughal dynasty that that when the king dies, the people you are most in danger from are your family. Your brothers are the people who will come to kill you. You know, and so you have to, or your son, you have to kill them first. You know, and that was generation after generation what had happened. You know, in this family, and suddenly you get this man who wants to rule by the affection of the people, you know, rather than the fear of the people. And to a very surprising degree, he succeeded. I mean, that's the odd thing, is that given that he was a tyrant, that he was not an unpopular tyrant. You know, because people saw that he was more fair than what had come before. I mean, for instance, there used to be a law in India in which there was an extra tax that you had to pay if you were not Muslim.
But he had a good beach with black eyes.
Yes, he was cute too. Yeah, I know. But he abolished the law, which the unjust taxation law, and so people could see that he was acting in such a way to be equally fair to all people. And so oddly, he was. I wouldn't say he was beloved, but he wasn't hated. You know, and for a tyrant, just not to be hated is not bad.
In the case of Latin America, plenty of tyrants are loved by people, and still loved. There is no contradiction between being a very tough ruler and be loved by people. I don't know. In the case of Akbar, the idea is what you said. So that was a good tyrant.
Yes.
A tyrant.
So he wanted to be a good tyrant, but he was a tyrant. Yes, no question.
He could be very violent.
He was very violent. Yeah, no, there was an occasion when somebody displeased him, and he personally took him up to the roof of the palace and threw him off, and he didn't die, which disappointed Akbar. So he went and picked him up and took him back up to the roof of the palace and threw him off again, but this time threw him off head first, and that worked.
What you said about, you know, the fact that you have to kill others before the others will kill you. Even in democracies, and there are some rules. For instance, in the case of Mexico, the president, as far as he is replaced by another one, shall disappear from the political scene. It's symbolic, like the father was killing, the son was killing the father. And it's very, very day by day experience. There's those who replace someone who try to destroy
well, actually, you know, even now in the United States, it is a convention that when you become the ex-president, you shut up.
That's right.
You know,
that's why I'm keeping silence.
Yeah.
So silent here. Yesterday you spoke like.
But President Lula complains to him. He said, "Are you proof to me, in fact, that I will be a silent former president?" I'm waiting.
Do you think in Brazil the way we think about presidents and chiefs of states that they are fathers, that we think of them like being fathers? We mentioned the populist presidents we had, or even Pedro II or Getúlio Vargas. And what's the image of the president here?
Yeah, there is, you know, we belong to this kind of society based on clientelism, on patriarchalism, so on and so forth. In the case of the emperor in Brazil, it was clear that the emperor, mainly the second one, was conceived as a father. But I don't know, nowadays it's different. Nowadays you have a secularization, urbanization. It's extremely difficult to keep the image of father as a strong image. But maybe yet, in some circumstances, yes, but it's not. I would say, but this is because this is a consequence of the lack of democracy. As far as democracy make progress, the idea of the president as a father has to disappear. He cannot be a father. He has to be a man who follows rules, not a father. Father means that you can do what you want to protect, and that's not good for democracy.
Okay, I think we must end. Thank you both for this brilliant debate. Thank you all for being so very kind. He's making a lot of noise.